Rain streaked the windows of Linda Johnson's small apartment, a gray curtain over a world that had turned its back on her. 52 years old, she sat at a folding table that doubled as her desk, staring at a bank statement that mocked her with a balance of $0.17. 25 years of marriage, 30 years in finance, and here she was broke, alone, and starting over. The ink on the divorce papers was barely dry, Mark's signature a jagged slash beside hers, and now this. A life stripped bare by the man who'd promised her forever. It started with a question, one that echoed in her mind as she traced the empty numbers with a fingertip. What would you do if the person who betrayed you came crawling back when they had nothing left? She didn't have an answer yet, but the sting of Mark's abandonment still burned fresh. A wound reopened every time she passed the house they'd shared, the house he now lived in with Emily, his 28-year-old assistant turned mistress. Linda had met Mark in 1995, back when she was a sharp-eyed accountant climbing the ranks at a mid-tier firm, her skin a rich brown against the sea of pale faces in boardrooms. He was a salesman then, charming and ambitious, with a smile that could sell ice to a snowstorm. They'd built something: 2 kids, a mortgage, a life until the kids grew up and moved out, and Mark decided 52 was too old for him. Face it, Linda, he'd said, packing his bags 2 years ago, Emily waiting in her red convertible outside. You're old and broke. I need someone who keeps up. He'd left her with nothing, cleaned out their joint accounts, took the house, left her to fend for herself. The job loss came next, a double blow that hit just as the divorce finalized. She'd been at the firm since '93, a steady hand in a chaotic industry, but a new VEET 30-something and obsessed with culture fit called her in one gray Monday. You're not aligning with our vision, he'd said, avoiding her eyes. We're letting you go. No severance, no notice, just a handshake and a security guard to walk her out. 30 years, and they tossed her like yesterday's trash. Now, she sat in this rented one-bedroom, the walls thin enough to hear her neighbor's TV, Mr. Whiskers the cat she'd kept from the old life napping on a thrift store couch. The apartment smelled of damp and regret, but Linda's eyes weren't wet with tears. They gleamed with something else: determination, a spark that hadn't died despite Mark's betrayal or the firm's dismissal. She'd lost everything, sure, but she wasn't finished. Not yet. Mark, meanwhile, was living high. 55 now, he'd climbed to VP at a tech startup, his suit sharper, his car flashier, a black Tesla that purred beside Emily's convertible in their driveway. Emily was 28, all legs and ambition, a former assistant who'd caught his eye with her quick smiles and quicker typing. She'd moved in fast, redecorating the house Linda had painted, filling it with modern art and her perfume. Mark thought he'd traded uppy out for age, excitement for stability, and he didn't spare Linda a thought, assuming she'd fade into obscurity, broke and broken. He'd underestimated her. Linda had always been the steady one, balancing budgets when he overspent, raising kids when he worked late, keeping their life afloat while he chased deals. She was tough, a black woman who'd fought for every inch in a world that rarely gave her a chance, and she wasn't about to roll over now. That night, after the bank statement stared her down, she pulled out a notebook, cheap, spiral-bound, bought from a dollar store, and started writing. Ideas, plans, numbers. She'd been in finance her whole career. She knew money, how it moved, how it grew. Mark could take her savings, her job, her house, but he couldn't take her mind. She thought of the women she'd met over the years, clients, co-workers, friends pushed aside like her, their potential ignored because of age or race or both. What if she built something for them? A business, small at first, to help women like her, minority women, older women, take control of their finances. No firm would hire her, fine. She'd hire herself. The next morning, she walked to the library, couldn't afford gas yet, and sat at a public computer, researching startups, loans, grants. Her hands moved fast, her mind sharper than it had been in years. She didn't have much, $50 from a pawn necklace, a laptop on its last legs, but she had grit. She'd start with what she had, build from the ground up. But the road ahead loomed dark. She applied to banks, pitching her idea, financial tech startup for the underserved, but the rejections piled up fast. Too risky, one loan officer said. barely glancing at her plan. "You don't fit the profile," another muttered, eyeing her graying hair and worn coat. No one saw potential in a 52-year-old black woman with no collateral. She'd hit bottom, and the world seemed happy to keep her there. Still, as she walked home under a sky heavy with clouds, something shifted. She passed a group of women outside, a bodega older, laughing, their voices strong despite the years, and felt a spark. They were like her, overlooked, underestimated. She could do this, not just for herself, but for them. The bank statement might be empty, but her resolve wasn't. Linda Johnson wasn't done, not by a long shot. What would she build from this nothing? And what would Mark say when he saw it? The library's hum of fluorescent lights and distant whispers wrapped around Linda Johnson like a warm blanket as she sat at the scratched public computer, her fingers tapping a rhythm of defiance. It had been a week since that rainy night with the empty bank statement, a week of sleepless hours plotting her comeback. 52 years old, broke, abandoned by Mark, and kicked out of her job's hit rock bottom, sure, but she wasn't staying there. The notebook beside her was full, now scribbled plans for a startup, a financial tech idea to help women like her take charge of their money. She'd spent her career crunching numbers. She could do this. She had to. But the world wasn't making it easy. That morning, she'd walked 3 miles to First National Bank, her coat damp from a spring drizzle, her pitch polished and ready. The lone Afikara pale guy in his 30s with a tie too tight barely let her finish. "Look, Ms. Johnson," he'd said, flipping through her proposal like it was junk mail. "This is a nice story, but you've got no collateral, no track record as an entrepreneur. People like you don't have the potential to run a business. Sorry." He'd slid the papers back, his smile thin, and Linda felt the sting race, age, all wrapped in that "people like you." She tried 3 more banks that week, each rejection sharper than the last. "Too old," one muttered. "No startup experience," another typed into his rejection form. "High risk," the third said, not even meeting her eyes. By Friday, she was back at the library, her $50 down to 30 after bus fare and printer ink, her confidence fraying at the edges. No one saw Linda Johnson, 52, black, family as a winner. To them, she was a liability, a middle-aged woman who should have stayed home, not dared to dream. Back at her apartment, Mr. Whiskers greeted her with a lazy stretch, his purr a small comfort as she sank onto the couch. The walls seemed closer, the damp smell sharper, and for a moment, doubt crept in. Mark's voice echoed, "You're old and broke," and she saw Emily's smirk in that red convertible, the life she'd built stolen by a younger woman who'd never known struggle. She could give up, take some low-wage gig, fade away like they expected. But that wasn't her. Linda Johnson didn't fade. She opened her notebook again, flipping past the rejections to a page she'd titled "Why." It was simple. Women like her, black women, older women, single moms, divorcees were ignored by banks, firms, the whole system. She'd seen it, her whole career, clients turned away, co-workers sidelined. What if she built something for them? A platform to manage money, grow savings, start businesses small, scrappy, but real. She didn't need a bank's blessing. She'd find a way. The spark came Sunday, outside the bodega down the street. A group of women, gray hair, brown skin, laughter loud despite the years, stood chatting over coffee and cigarettes. Linda paused, listening as one, a wiry woman named May, griped about a loan denied for her catering side hustle. "They said I'm too old at 58, May scoffed. "Like I don't know how to cook." Another, Clara, nodded. "Same here, wanted to open a daycare, but the bank laughed me out." Linda stepped closer, her voice cutting through the chatter. "What if someone helped you? Not a bank, someone who gets it." They turned, curious, and she laid it out, her idea, rough but alive. May grinned. "You do that, sister, I'm in." Clara handed her a crumpled $5. "Seed money," she said, winking. "Don't you let you stop you." That night, Linda counted her cash, $35 now, and smiled for the first time in weeks. It wasn't much, but it was hers, earned from women who saw her when the suits wouldn't. She started small, real small, using her old laptop to build a basic app, teaching herself code from free online tutorials. She called it Rise Up Finance, a name that felt like a promise. She pitched it door to door at her neighborhood women like May and Clara, single moms juggling rent, retirees with pensions too thin. "I'll help you save," she'd say, "grow what you've got." Some laughed, some shut the door, but a few signed up $10 a month for advice, budgeting a shot or more. By month 3, she had 20 clients, $200 rolling in, not enough to live on, but enough to keep going. She worked late, her apartment a mess of papers and coffee cups, Mr. Whiskers her only company. The banks still said no, investors ignored her calls, but she didn't need them yet. She had her people, women who'd been dismissed, underestimated, just like her. They spread the word, slow but steady, and Rise Up grew 30 clients, then 50, a tiny spark catching fire. Mark didn't notice, of course. He was too busy. New house with Emily, a promotion to CEO at his startup, flaunting his Tesla at industry galas. He thought Linda was finished, a footnote in his climb, and Emily egged him on, her ambition matching his. "She's nothing now," Emily'd say, sipping wine on their new deck, and Mark'd laugh, agreeing. They didn't see the storm building. Linda's quiet grind, her app gaining traction, her name whispered in corners they'd never reach. But the road was rough. Linda hit walls, tech glitches she couldn't fix, bills piling up, nights where she wondered if Mark was right. She'd sit with that notebook, tracing the why, and push on. The women kept her going. May sending her first catering gigs profits, Clara bragging about savings for her daycare. They believed in her, and that was fuel. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for them. One evening, exhausted but wired, she checked her app stats. 80 users, $800 a month. Small potatoes to Mark's millions, but it was hers, built from nothing. She leaned back, Mr. Whiskers purring beside her, and felt the shift. She wasn't broke, not in spirit, not in will. Mark could have his Tesla, his mistress, his ego. Linda Johnson was rising, and she'd make sure he'd see it one day. Hey, if you've ever been counted out, hold you're too old, too broke, too anything, hit that like button and drop your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. 5 years had carved new lines into the world since Linda Johnson sat in that damp apartment, counting crumpled bills and dreaming of a comeback. The city had shifted around her, new high-rises piercing the skyline, old bodegas giving way to coffee shops, but Linda had shifted too. Rise Up Finance wasn't just a spark anymore. It was a fire, burning bright and steady. 52 had turned to 57, her hair grayer, her eyes sharper, and now she stood at the helm of a tech startup that had gone from a rickety app to a name on every financial newsstand in town. It had started slow, those first 80 users growing to hundreds, then thousands, as word spread through neighborhoods, churches, community centers. Linda had poured everything into it, late nights coding, days pitching to anyone who'd listen, her voice steady despite the rejections. She'd scraped by on ramen and grit, Mr. Whiskers her silent partner, until a small grant from a women's business fund gave her the boost she needed. By year 3, Rise Up had a real officey, a cramped space above a laundromat, but it was hers, staffed by women like May and Clara, who'd become her first employees. Year 4 brought investors, cautious at first, then eager as the numbers climbed. Now, in year 5, Linda was CEO, her company valued at $10 million, helping minority women nationwide manage money, build businesses, break free. The press loved her. From broke to boss, the Herald splashed across its front page a photo of Linda in a sharp blazer, arms crossed, smiling faint but fierce. Forbes called her the face of resilience, detailing how a 52-year-old black woman, dumped by her husband and fired from her job, built an empire from nothing. She'd read the articles at her new desk, sleek wood, a far cry from that folding table Mr. Whiskers napping in a sunbeam nearby, and felt a quiet pride, not for the headlines, but for the women she'd lifted. May's catering, now a chain, Clara's daycare thriving, thousands more with savings they'd never had before. But the real jolt came that morning, a crisp Tuesday in May, when her assistante, a bright 20-something named Tasha, dropped a folder on her desk. "You'll want to see this," Tasha said, her voice low, a grin tugging at her lips. Linda flipped it open, and there it was, a grainy news clipping, Mark Johnson's face staring back, haggard and unshaven. Tech CEO bankrupt after risky deals collapse, the headline read. She scanned it quick. His startup, bloated on bad investments and over-leveraged loans, had tanked. Debts in the millions, creditors circling, Emily long gone. Mark was broke, finished, a shadow of the man who'd laughed her out of their marriage. Linda leaned back, twirling a pen between her fingers, a smile creeping up slow and sharp. 5 years ago, he'd stood in their old living room, bags packed, sneering. "Face it, Linda, you're old and broke." Now here he was, the tables turned so hard they flipped upside down. She didn't gloat, not out loud, but the irony tasted sweet. He'd thought her nothing, a relic to discard for Emily's youth. But while he chased flash, she'd built substance. Rise Up wasn't just a company. It was proof she was more than he'd ever seen. Tasha lingered, watching her. "He's in deep," she said, tapping the folder. "Owing $8 million to banks, another 2 to private lenders. Word is he's desperate, selling what's left, begging for bailouts." Linda nodded, setting the pen down. She could picture him, Mark. 59 now, his charm faded, his Tesla repossessed, scrambling to save what he'd squandered. Emily wouldn't stick around for that. She'd jump ship the second the money dried up, leaving him alone in that house Linda had once called home. Her mind churned, the past bubbling up. 25 years of marriage, propping him up while he climbed, only to be tossed aside when her youth ran out. She'd fought back, not with tears but with work, turning his old and broke into a weapon. Now, he was the one broken, and she held the power, not just money, but the kind of strength he'd never understand. She didn't need him to see it, not yet, but the thought of him knowing, of him facing her rise while he fell, lit a fire she hadn't felt in years. The office buzzed around her, phones ringing, keyboards clacking, a team of women building what she'd started. She stood, smoothing her blazer, and walked to the window, looking out at a city that had doubted her too. 5 years ago, she'd been invisible, fired, divorced, dismissed. Now, she was a name, a force, and Mark was the ghost. Tasha's voice cut through her thoughts. "What are you going to do about him?" Linda turned, that faint smile still playing on her lips, the pen spinning again in her hand. "Nothing yet," she said, her tone calm but edged. "Let him stew a little longer." She didn't know what came next, forgiveness, indifference, or something sharper, but she'd be ready when it did. Mark had no idea what he'd unleashed when he walked out, and she'd make sure he felt it. A late summer storm rumbled over the city, the sky bruising purple as Linda Johnson stood at her office window, watching rain streak the glass like tears she'd long stopped shedding. 5 years had built Rise Up Finance into a forced-in $1 million strong, a beacon for women the world had overlooked, and Linda, now 57, wore her success like armor. The headlines still buzzed with her name, but today a different storm was brewing, one she hadn't seen coming till Tasha dropped the bombshell at lunch. Mark Johnson wanted to see her. The call had come that morning, his voice crackling through her assistant's line, hoarse, desperate, a far cry from the smug drawl that had once told her she was old and broke. "He begged," Tasha said, handing her a coffee with a raised brow. "Said it's urgent." Sounded like a man drowning. Linda had nodded, calm on the outside, but inside, her pulse kicked up. Mark, broke and begging, after 5 years of silence? She'd agreed to meet him not out of kindness, but curiosity. What could he possibly want now? He showed up at 4, the rain soaking his cheap suede, a far cry from the tailored threads he'd flaunted with Emily. The office was quiet, most staff gone for the day, and Linda watched from her desk as he shuffled in, Tasha ushering him through. 59, graying fast, his face etched with lines of failure. Mark looked like a man who'd lost everything, and he had. The Tesla was gone, the house foreclosed, his startup a smoking ruin of bad deals and unpaid debts. Emily had bolted months ago, the papers said, leaving him alone in a rented room downtown. He stood there, dripping on her hardwood floor, eyes darting like a trapped animal. "Linda," he started, voice low, shaky. "To need your help. I am drowning. $8 million in debt, creditors on my back. You got money now, power. Please, just a loan, anything. I'll pay you back." She didn't move, just leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, letting the silence stretch. 5 years ago, he'd walked out with Emily on his arm, her life's savings in his pocket, laughing as he called her nothing. Now he was here, begging, and the twist hit hard. He didn't just need cash, needed her. The woman he'd discarded, the one he'd mocked, was his last lifeline. She almost laughed, but the sound caught in her throat, replaced by a cold, steady calm. "You need my help?" she said finally, her tone even cutting. "After you took everything, our house, our accounts, 25 years and left me with nothing? You think I owe you something?" Mark flinched, rubbing a hand over his face, stubble rasping under his fingers. "I was wrong, okay? I messed up Emily, the business, all of it. She's gone, Linda. Took what was left and ran. I've got no one else. You're doing good now. I saw the papers. Just a little help for old time's sake." The room darkened as thunder rolled, and Linda felt the weight of his words, pathetic, hollow, a man grasping at straws. She could have said no right there, sent him back to the rain, let him sink. But then the door opened, and Emily walked in, 28 still, but harder now, her heels clicking sharp on the floor. Tasha trailed her, apologetic. She insisted. Tasha muttered, and Linda waved her off, eyes locked on the woman who'd stolen her life. Emily smirked, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Thought I'd find you here, Mark," she said, voice dripping venom. "Begging your ex?" Pathetic. She turned to Linda, sizing her up. "Heard you're the big shot now. Guess you landed on your feet." Linda stood slow, deliberate, and walked to her desk, pulling a thick folder from a drawer. She set it down with a thud, right in front of Mark and Emily, her gaze steady. "This," she said, tapping it, "is your debt, Mark. $8 million to banks, 2 to private lenders. I didn't just land on my feet, I built something. And I bought it all up last week." Mark's face went white, his mouth opening, closing, no sound coming out. Emily's smirk faltered, her eyes narrowing. "What?" she snapped, but Linda didn't flinch. "Every dime you owe," Linda said, voice low, lethal. "I own it now. You don't just owe the banks, you owe me." The air thickened, the storm outside a dull roar against the silence in the room. Mark sank into a chair, hands shaking, the reality hitting him like a freight train. Emily stepped back, her heels unsteady, her exit already forming. Linda watched the man who'd betrayed her, the woman who'd taken her place, and felt the darkest moment settle in. She could crush him here, call in the debt, watch him lose the last scraps of his life. He'd left her broke, humiliated, and now she held his fate in her hands. But she didn't stop there. "I'm not bailing you out," she said, her words slow, deliberate. "You'll pay or you'll lose what's left. Your call." Mark's head dropped, a broken man, and Emily turned, storming out without a word, her heels echoing down the hall. Linda stayed standing, the folder a silent threat between them, her power absolute. She'd planned this, not the meeting, but the move. When Tasha showed her the bankruptcy news, she'd acted fast, buying his debt through rise-up's growing clout, turning his ruin into her leverage. It wasn't just revenge, it was justice, a reckoning for every woman he'd dismissed, every life he'd wrecked. Now he'd face it, and she'd walk away taller. Thunder lingered in the distance, a fading growl as the storm moved off, leaving the city slick and quiet under a clearing sky. Inside Linda Johnson's office, the air still crackled with the aftermath of Mark's plea, the folder of his debts a silent judge on the desk between them. 57 years old, Linda stood tall, her gray hair catching the soft light, her presence a wall Mark couldn't breach. He sat slumped, 59 and broken, his cheap suit wrinkled, his hands trembling as Emily's heels faded down the hall, her exit a final nail in his coffin. Mark looked up, eyes red, voice barely a whisper. "You're really doing this, Linda? After everything we had?" The words hung there, weak and desperate, a last grasp at guilt she'd long shed. 5 years ago, he'd walked out with Emily, taking their house, their savings, her dignity, and now he dared invoke everything we had. Linda's jaw tightened, but her calm held as steel forged from betrayal and triumph. "Everything we had?" she said, her tone low, cutting. You mean 25 years I gave you raising our kids, keeping us afloat while you chase your ego? You left me with nothing, Mark. Call me old and broke. Now look at you. She tapped the folder, deliberate slow. I bought your debt. 8 million to the banks, 2 to the lenders. You don't owe them any more you owe me. And I'm not here to save you. He flinched, head dropping, the truth sinking in. Linda had turned his words into prophecy, not hers, but his. Rise Up Finance wasn't just her victory, it was his undoing. She'd built it from scratch, $50 and a dream, while he squandered millions on bad deals, flashy toys, and a woman who'd bailed when the cash ran dry. Emily's departure had been the high note, walking out mid-confrontation, leaving Mark alone with the woman he'd scorned, now holding his fate. The room went still, the only sound his ragged breathing. Linda stepped closer, her shadow falling over him, and delivered the final blow. "You've got 30 days, she said, voice steady as stone. Pay up, or I call in every cent. Your condo, your accounts, whatever's left. You'll lose it all just like I did. Difference is I came back. You won't." Mark's face crumpled, a sob breaking free, but Linda didn't blink. She cried her tears 5 years ago alone, broke, staring at an empty bank account while he laughed with Emily in their stolen home. Now he wept, and she felt nothing but the weight of justice, earned through every late night, every rejection, every dollar she clawed back. He'd thought her weak, a relic to discard, but she'd risen stronger than he'd ever been. She turned, walking to the window, leaving him, the Chira man, reduced to rubble. Outside, the city glowed under fresh-washed streets, a mirror to her own rebirth. Rise Up wasn't just a company. It was her legacy, 10 million strong, lifting women he'd never see, women like May and Clara who believed in her when no one else did. Mark's ruin was the coda, a reckoning he'd brought on himself. He stumbled up, voice cracking. "Linda, please," he got nothing left. She didn't turn, just watched his reflection in the glass, small, diminished, a ghost of the man who'd betrayed her. "You had everything," she said, quiet but firm. "You chose to throw it away. Live with it." He lingered, then shuffled out, the door clicking shut behind him, a sound as final as their divorce. Linda stayed at the window, the folder untouched on her desk. She wouldn't call the debt yet. Let him sweat. Let him scramble. Let him feel the nothing he'd left her with. If he paid, fine. If he didn't, she'd take what was hers. Either way, she'd won not just money, but power, the kind Mark never understood. She'd rebuilt from zero while he fell from millions, and that was the real victory. Days later, the papers ran it, XEO's debts bought by a estranged wife's startup. The story spread, Mark a cautionary tale, Linda a hero. She didn't read the comments, didn't need to. Rise Up's phones rang off the hook, new clients, new investors, her legacy growing. Mr. Whiskers purred at her feet that night, the apartment long gone for a modest house she'd bought herself, and Linda Smoleta, a real one, small but deep. She'd faced the man who'd broken her, and left him in the dust he'd meant for her. Here's what sticks. You don't have to stay down. Linda didn't. 52, broke, betrayed, she rose anyway. Maybe you've been there, someone counted you out, left you behind. What did you do? Tell me in the comments side, love to know. Was Linda right to let Mark twist, or should she have helped? Let's talk. Thanks for sticking with this one. It's been a ride, and I'm glad you're here. If it hit you somewhere real, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and share it with someone who needs it. More stories like this are coming. Catch the next one soon. See you there.